The White House briefing room was unusually quiet that afternoon. Beneath the polished marble, beneath the camera clicks and carefully rehearsed statements, a storm was forming, one not of diplomacy, but of defiance. President Donald Trump, arms folded, stared at the digital map of West Africa glowing on the screen in front of him. His jaw was clenched. Aides whispered around him, but he wasn't listening. His attention was fixed on one name, Burkina Faso, and one face, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Enough of this nonsense, Trump growled. We either lead Africa again, or we take it back. The room froze. No one moved. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. His advisors exchanged nervous glances. Some had heard rumors, chatter from Pentagon analysts, that Traoré was becoming more than a local populist. He was building something bigger, a continental resistance. Thousands of miles away, in a modest government hall in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood before a crowd of young officers, journalists, and tribal leaders. He wore his standard fatigues, nothing ceremonial. No medals, no gold, just resolve. They want Africa to kneel again, he said, voice sharp. But they've forgotten, we are not what we were. We have paid in blood, in silence, in dust. But not again. Cheers erupted, fists raised. Traoré's eyes, however, remained focused, cold and steady. He wasn't celebrating. He was preparing. Behind closed doors in both nations, orders were drafted. Troop movements were discussed. Satellites repositioned. And over encrypted lines, Trump issued the threat that would set everything into motion. Deploy the fleet. If Traoré steps out of line, we cross in full force. That night, a single photo from a satellite captured it all. American naval vessels adjusting course off the Gulf of Guinea, and a small convoy of armored trucks heading west from Ouagadougou. Neither man blinked, and the world had no idea what was about to unfold. The sun over Ouagadougou was merciless that morning, baking the red earth into hardened clay as Traoré's convoy rolled into the edge of the capital. The dust, kicked up by armored wheels, clung to the air like tension to a battlefield. But inside Traoré's lead vehicle, there was no music, no idle chatter, only the grim silence of strategy. He had read the satellite intel, he had seen the U.S. fleet shift in the Atlantic, and he had heard the words Trump barked to the Pentagon. Tell him to step back, or we'll come through him. But Traoré wasn't stepping back, he was stepping forward. Standing before an assembly of African journalists and international envoys at the Independence Square, he raised a single photo, an American naval carrier, then dropped it on the podium. We know where your weapons are, he said, but do you know where your soul is? Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. The words weren't just a warning, they were a challenge. Every syllable was deliberate, aimed not just at Trump's military, but at America's conscience. Across the ocean, Trump was watching, live. His fingers tapped the armrest of his chair like a drum of war. He wants to play rough, Trump muttered. Fine. Within hours, drone surveillance intensified over the Sahel. Military bases in Djibouti and Ghana were put on high alert. And a draft of a strategic containment plan was slid across the president's desk. But none of it shook Traoré. Not the pressure, not the veiled threats, not the American media calling him a reckless populist. He stood before the press once again, this time holding something else, a rusted colonial chain once worn by an African slave. I don't fear invasion, he said, I fear silence. And I won't be silent. The press room stood still. Even the American correspondents didn't dare interrupt. That night, all across West Africa, murals went up on concrete walls and market stalls. They bore two faces, Trump's and Traoré's. Underneath them, one phrase sprayed in bold black paint. Cross the line, if you dare. Night fell over Burkina Faso like a veil soaked in gasoline, thick, waiting to ignite. In the darkness, the streets of Ouagadougou pulsed with energy. Young men and women marched with torches, not in protest, but in preparation. On walls, in alleyways, in underground cafes, one name echoed like a drumbeat, Traoré. Across the globe, the Pentagon was no longer whispering. The word, invasion, was now being briefed behind closed doors with red folders and satellite projections. "We can be in the capital in 48 hours, said one general. But the president wasn't satisfied with plans, he wanted a spectacle. "Make it loud," Trump growled. "Make him beg." Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood in his war room, a modest bunker beneath the presidential palace. His advisors were tense. His generals were defiant. But Traoré? He was calm. He tapped the map showing U.S. naval movements inching closer to the Gulf of Guinea. Then he pointed to the mines. "Gold, lithium, cobalt. This is why they come," he said. "Not for peace. Not for democracy. For power. And they fear what happens when we own it." Someone asked if he would negotiate. Traoré stared for a moment, then spoke with ice in his voice. "You don't negotiate with thieves. You protect your house, and if they enter, you burn it behind them." His words weren't rhetoric. They were policy. That same night, he appeared on Pan-African broadcast. Wearing his plain brown fatigues and speaking from a single spotlight, Traoré addressed not just his people, but the world. To Trump, and those who follow him, "You threaten war as if we are strangers to it. But Africa was born in fire, and it remembers." Across the continent, screens flickered with his face. In South Africa, students stood and cheered. In Kenya, market vendors paused their work to watch. In Ghana, even skeptical politicians nodded in silence. Then came the response from Washington. Trump, red-faced in front of cameras, declared, "We will teach him respect." But in the palaces and prisons of the global south, leaders whispered something else entirely. Traoré just became the storm. The sun rose like a blade over the Sahel, casting long shadows over a continent that had grown tired of bending the knee. In Ouagadougou, it wasn't just another day, it was the beginning of the standoff. Reports flooded in from military outposts, American drones circling low, satellite pings increasing, diplomatic channels going eerily quiet. It was the calm before Washington's storm. But Traoré? He was already moving. In a dusty compound outside the city, he walked among Burkina Faso's newly trained National Guard. No medals. No salutes. Just silence, and resolve. He looked each soldier in the eye and asked one question. "Would you die for your people?" The answers didn't come in words, but in fists pressed to chests and eyes locked in fire. That afternoon, he called an emergency summit of the Alliance of Sahel States. Leaders from Mali and Niger joined him in person, while others tuned in across Africa. Traoré didn't posture. He didn't recite slogans. He spoke like a man lighting the fuse beneath colonial history. "They come for our minerals. They come for our silence. But this time, they will leave with nothing but their shame." At the same hour, Trump stepped to a podium draped in stars and stripes. With a sneer, he proclaimed, "Africa needs order. We're bringing it, whether they want it or not." The U.S. press room erupted with applause. But in cities across Africa, people turned off their televisions in disgust. Not because they feared Trump, but because they recognized the pattern. First they say you're unstable. Then they say they'll help. And then they come to take. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré stood before his people in the Place de la Révolution. His voice rang out without a microphone. "Let them come. And if they cross this line, they will find not just resistance, but reckoning." That night, an image circled the globe, Traoré standing on the red earth of Burkina Faso, behind him a massive wall of volunteers, miners, mothers, students, and soldiers, all holding the flag. No tanks, no billion-dollar weapons, just a message written across the wall behind them. Africa is not your playground. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the world had split in two. On one side stood a superpower with satellites in the sky, fleets in the ocean, and egos on fire. On the other stood a man with no navy, no nukes, just millions who had been betrayed too many times to kneel again. In Washington, Trump gathered his Security Council. The Situation Room buzzed with maps, targets, and options. A general pointed at a screen. "We strike infrastructure first. Communication towers, energy grids. Then we move in advisors. Fast." Trump didn't blink. "No. We start with the gold, that's why we're there. The room fell into an eerie hush. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré met with his intelligence chief, a former miner-turned-war strategist. The man tossed a U.S. document onto the table, a declassified memo outlining the resource zones to be secured under American control. Traoré scanned it, then smiled. They've planned everything, except for our hearts. Outside, villagers from across Burkina Faso arrived on foot, motorcycles, donkeys, however they could. They weren't there to protest. They were there to enlist, to prepare, to stand. They carried no rifles, just shovels, machetes, and flags. CNN called it panic. Al Jazeera called it mobilization. Burkinabe called it homecoming. In a private interview aired hours later, Trump declared, "Africa's only power comes from chaos. We'll tame it, just like we did before." But then came Traoré's response, broadcast live across Africa. "You think we are chaos? No, we are the storm that will drown your empire." The broadcast froze mid-sentence for American viewers. Cut off, interrupted, silenced, but it was too late. The video had already gone viral. From Harlem to Johannesburg, from Cairo to Sao Paulo, the world saw the look in Traoré's eyes, not desperation, but calculation. He wasn't waiting. He was preparing. And every drone in the sky would soon realize that the battlefield wasn't in the air. It was in the hearts of those who'd finally decided. Never again. The early morning heat of the Sahel didn't just weigh on the skin, it pressed into the bones like a warning. Traoré stood atop the cliffs of Djibo, where centuries ago ancestors had repelled colonizers with nothing but spears and strategy. Now, the battlefield had shifted, drones replaced war drums, but the rhythm of resistance had never stopped beating. Below, a crowd gathered not for war, but for witness. Elders, children, youth in football jerseys and mothers with babies tied to their backs. Traoré had summoned them not to fight, but to remember. "They come for our gold," he said, voice echoing across the rocks, "but they forget, we're forged from it." His words weren't scripted. They didn't need to be. A live stream beamed his speech across the continent. In universities from Nairobi to Lagos, dorm rooms erupted in chants. In villages with no running water, people gathered around battery-powered radios. At that same hour, in the Situation Room, Trump's advisors debated timing. One urged swift cyberstrikes. Another advised precision raids on Traoré's inner circle. But Trump slammed the table. "I want that mine. Not next month. Now." Meanwhile, satellite feeds flickered to life. But what they showed baffled analysts, men and women walking toward the gold fields unarmed. No weapons. No uniforms. Just resolve. "Are they civilians?" one general asked. "They're shields," another whispered. "Human ones." Traoré knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just defense, it was defiance. Turning every village into a line in the sand. Every face a warning sign. Back in New York, protesters flooded Times Square. Banners read, "Hands off Africa. Not your mines. Not your war." Traoré speaks. We listen. For the first time, America wasn't just divided, it was doubting. The images from Burkina Faso weren't of terrorists or warlords. They were farmers, teachers, elders. And in every frame, one thing echoed. If they invade, they won't just find gold. They'll drown in the soul of a continent. Washington underestimated him. That was Traoré's quiet advantage. As news of the Burkina uprising spread across major networks, Trump barked orders to deploy private military contractors. Not uniformed soldiers, mercenaries. Plausible deniability. Ruthless efficiency. "They'll be in and out before he even knows what hit him," Trump said, leaning back in his chair. "Africa bends when we press." But that's where he miscalculated. By the time the boots hit the red dust of Ouagadougou, the landscape had already shifted. Not physically, but morally. International journalists had arrived, drawn by the audacity of Traoré's stand. The eyes of the world were no longer on Washington. They were on West Africa. And what they saw was not chaos, it was choreography. Roads were closed not with barricades, but with women holding hands and singing in dozens of dialects. At every corner, street artists painted murals of resistance. Traoré holding a scale, Netanyahu's bombs on one side, African gold on the other. In a hidden war room beneath the Ministry of Energy, Traoré met with his inner circle. "We won't stop them from landing," he said. "Let them come." They looked at him, startled. He smiled. "They expect to find a war. Let them find a movement." Meanwhile, in Texas, Scott Bessent sat in a private boardroom, furious. Why hasn't the mine been secured yet? A whisper from the screen, because Traoré turned the mine into a memorial site. Every inch of that land is live-streamed 24/7. If they fire a shot, it'll be seen from space. Bessent's glass shattered against the wall. Then start a riot. Make it look like savages tore it apart themselves. But Traoré had predicted that, too. He released a pre-recorded message across African media. If there's violence, it won't be ours. If there's sabotage, it won't be from our hands. But if they touch one stone of our land, we'll bury their greed with it. The message wasn't just a warning. It was a dare. And America was about to step into the trap, not of landmines, but of truth gone viral. The helicopters hovered over Burkina Faso like metal vultures, American logos scraped off, mercenary flags barely visible under the dust. In Washington, Trump smirked. In Riyadh, MBS watched silently. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu leaned forward. But in Ouagadougou? Traoré stood still. He didn't send troops. He sent silence. A silence so dense, it echoed. The streets emptied. Not from fear, but strategy. Every camera, every drone, every journalist had been positioned to document the so-called liberation. And when the boots hit the ground, the footage told a different story. No chaos. No insurgents. No resistance. Just schoolchildren painting murals of Africa rising. Just elders reciting oral histories in marketplaces. Just Traoré's face on every wall, not as a dictator, but as a defender. One mercenary muttered, "What the hell are we doing here?" In Washington, the Pentagon's report reached Trump. No viable targets. No engagement from hostiles. Troops reporting, confusion. Trump growled, "Then make it messy." Within hours, a staged explosion rocked a water station. Western media ran with it. But before the dust settled, a video surfaced. It was raw, shaky, shot by a child. A soldier planting the bomb. An American accent. A private badge. Traoré uploaded it everywhere. No edits. No subtitles. Just truth. It exploded louder than the bomb ever could. In African capitals, protests erupted, not against Traoré, but against foreign sabotage. Even in Europe, analysts on news panels whispered. This is starting to feel like 1953 Iran again, but the ending may be very different. In New York, a mural was painted overnight in Harlem, Traoré holding a cracked American helmet, above it the words. "You came to mine gold. We found your mask." The empire was slipping. And Traoré wasn't chasing it. He was replacing it. At 3 o'clock Ouagadougou time, Traoré stood before the African Union via secure feed. His face was calm, but his tone was unyielding. Burkina Faso will treat any foreign incursion as an act of war, including proxy operations disguised as aid or peacekeeping. We will not fall for old tricks wrapped in new logos. Across the continent, presidents exchanged glances. Some nervous. Some inspired. But all alert. That same morning, a convoy of U.S. military vehicles crossed into a disputed mineral zone between Mali and Niger. It was supposed to be quiet, routine, just a survey team. But they didn't get far. A single drone, black, unbranded, Burkina-made, hovered above. Then came the broadcast, across every frequency. Return immediately. Or be disarmed. The Americans laughed. Until their comms went dark. Their GPS scrambled. Their engines failed one by one. By noon, every soldier was sitting beside their stalled Humvees, swatting flies and questioning orders. They weren't attacked, they were humiliated. Powerless. And Traoré hadn't even lifted a weapon. He had drawn a line. And they crossed it. Back in Washington, Trump bellowed into a briefing room. He's not a president, he's a threat. But Traoré knew that line too. He smiled when he read it on social media, reposted by young Africans with the caption. That's the point. In an emergency press conference, the U.S. Secretary of Defense claimed the technical failures were due to heat and terrain. But journalists pushed harder. A Nigerian reporter asked, "Is the U.S. losing the digital battlefield to a so-called third world nation?" There was no answer. Meanwhile, Traoré made one more move. He released blueprints of low-cost anti-drone tech, made in collaboration with engineers from Kenya, South Africa, and Sudan. Open source. Free to use. Africa's first collective defense system. One headline read, "Traoré isn't just fighting back. He's teaching others how." And Trump? He had drawn a line. But Traoré redrew the map. The world now watched not through headlines, but live streams. From Accra to Algiers, Nairobi to New Orleans, young people tuned in not for spectacle, but for a reckoning. In the United Nations Security Council chamber, the air was tense. Trump had requested a closed-door session to issue one final ultimatum to Ibrahim Traoré. But Traoré wasn't interested in backroom threats. He made his way in calmly, dressed in the same tan military fatigues he wore when he ousted the French-backed regime. As he walked past diplomats, many nodded, not in greeting, but in respect. Trump was already there, fuming. He slammed a thick folder on the table. "You've threatened American assets, resisted sanctions, humiliated my people on every global stage. I'm here to give you one last chance, stand down. Or we will invade." A silence followed. All eyes turned to Traoré. He looked at the folder. Then back at Trump. And he laughed. Not mockingly. But with the calm of a man who had already calculated every move on the board. "You think Africa fears war, Mr. Trump? Africa was born in war. But this time, we won't fight with machetes and silence. We have satellites. Code. And unity." He turned to the chamber. "I say this not just for Burkina Faso, but for every land you once called your playground. If America dares to invade, it won't just be met with resistance. It will be met with collapse." Then, he laid a small black device on the table. "That," he said, "is a blockchain encrypted kill switch for every smart mine America has touched in Africa. One command, and your machines stop. Your profits vanish. Your influence crumbles." The U.S. ambassador reached to protest, but Traoré raised a hand. "Don't test it. We've already tested you." The room froze. Cameras captured Trump blinking, confused. Traoré's voice echoed again. "This isn't a threat. It's an equation. You invaded for gold. But we rewrote the math." Outside, protests surged, not just in Africa, but across Europe and America. Placards read, "No more puppets. Power respects power. Traoré didn't blink. He exited the chamber like a general leaving a battlefield, not because he'd won it, but because he owned it. And that was the day America backed down. Not because Traoré begged, but because he dared them to cross the line, and they finally saw what waited on the other side.